But our second panel today is the policy panel, which really starts to bridge off of that first set of conversations that we're asking policymakers to hold developers accountable and also think about framing and sort of shaping and initiating social value within the built realm. And so we're looking forward to hearing from Majestic, Karilyn, and Taylor. And I'll turn it over to Karilyn.
Great. Everyone, welcome to the Public Policy panel. This is where ideas come to be born. So I'm going to put all of that very, very high bar on our conversation because there's such an opportunity to think about what public policy can do, how it can be an intervention, tool, platform, way to think about how do you take the data, how do you take the conditions, and how do you think about the people, put those things together and think about what transformative change can be made and how you really put your arms around multiple actors being involved in that decision making, investors, voters, civic leaders, politicians, governments. How can we think about multi sets of tables, multiple actors, multiple institutions really trying to come together around this question around public policy, but specifically around equitable investment and what that means for transforming real estate. And that is why we're here. So I am delighted to be here as a moderator for this panel. So my job is to kind of keep us on track a little bit, to set a table, to introduce our esteemed panelists who will introduce themselves and talk a little bit, and then really to open up the floor for some questions and conversations so that we can see what's on your mind. You've had an incredible day so far, lots of conversation, lots of content, and we'd like to think about this point at the midpoint of the day as a chance to kind of chew on, literally, it seems like some people are chewing, chew on what you're thinking about, and really try to bring that into the service of a conversation about public policy, what it means, what's at stake, and how we can learn from folks who are in the field. And so I come to you as someone who is here at MIT as a lecturer in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I'm a lecturer in urban policy and urban planning. And before that, I was in government. And so I am a government refugee. Sometimes I call myself recovering bureaucrat or public servant, however you think of it. I was the director of economic policy and research for the city of Boston. And it was very interesting because in that role, I was really put to the task of trying to implement Mayor Walsh's equity strategy in terms of economic development. Many of you may know that Mayor Marjay Walsh was the first mayor in 20 years in Boston. So for many of us that grew up here, including myself, this was the first mayor in our adult lifetime. And so although I have lots of questions and skepticism about local, state, federal government, the whole apparatus myself, there was something very historic and interesting about being able to be a part of a progressive administration when, again, for me and many others, this was the first time we had a new mayor in a very long time. And so that was my role, and had done quite a bit of research in terms of land use change and development and the convergence between social movements, grassroots mobilizations, and the role that those movements can play in setting new policies historically and in a contemporary context. So wonderful to have a chance to have served in a mayoral administration, a new one, for 4 years, and really to kind of really put my shoulder to the wheel in thinking about how do you make some of these ideas about more equitable investments and change possible using policy, and what are the limitations? And what does it mean if you're trying to think about equity in a very, very broad way and bringing as many actors to the table as possible to set new legislative agendas? And so that was the role. So I'm happy to be here to facilitate this conversation and talk for me about what that means in terms of job creation, small business development, and even construction jobs, which I'll talk a little bit about. But before that, I want to be sure to introduce our panelists. And so right here to my immediate left is Majestic Lane, coming to us from the city of Pittsburgh, where Majestic is the Chief Equity Officer and Deputy Chief of Staff there working with a very exciting mayor. I may add, I have a little fandom going on here. Yeah. So, as the Chief Equity Officer and Deputy Chief of Staff, Majestic leads the Peduto administration's focus on opportunity for all residents of the city of Pittsburgh concerning education, workforce development, safe and healthy communities, and digital inclusion. Additionally, Majestic leads the administration's engagement with national organizations regarding equity and inclusion strategies. Prior to serving as Deputy Chief of Staff, Majestic was the Deputy Chief of Neighborhood Empowerment, where he coordinated the administration's neighborhood equity efforts through community-driven development and affordable housing initiatives. Majestic attended the University of Pittsburgh and now lives in a place called North Point Breeze. Does that sound lovely? It sounds really wonderful. So welcome to Cambridge, right?
There's some politics to North Point Breeze, but
I believe we want to hear about that. Next to Majestic is Taylor Cain, Dr. Taylor Cain, who is the director of the City of Boston's Housing Innovation Lab. Some of you may know this work a bit. As the director there, Taylor leads the citywide efforts to pioneer innovative housing models and systems and accelerate the pace of innovation in the housing sector that promotes inclusion and equity across Boston neighborhoods. The Housing Innovation Lab, under Taylor's leadership, will continue to take an innovative approach to addressing Boston's housing challenges. Good, because there are many. Since first being established by Mayor Walsh in 2015, it's called the iLab, has worked with residents and stakeholders to encourage the creation of new housing prototypes that promote affordability and alternative living arrangements. Taylor is a JP resident, completed her PhD in sociology at BU, and also holds a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan. In addition to her academic pursuits, Taylor has worked with local nonprofit organizations and institutions on evaluation and research projects that focus on a range of issues, including economic development, racial equity, and displacement. And so Taylor she says she's fallen into curiosity with Boston during her first few years of grad school, as she experienced the city and its neighborhoods through different forms of public transportation and trying to figure that out. That could be a next job for you, in fact. There. And so Taylor brings a sociological imagination to addressing many of the challenges of ensuring that the city of Boston grows inclusively. So I want to be sure to welcome both Taylor and Majestic. Please join me in welcoming them. So we just want to open it up a little bit. I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves. I want to pose a couple questions, kind of a lightning round a little bit to hear what their thoughts are, how they get their work done. And so for the two of you, I think we just really want to start by centering your introduction and our discussion on these two questions that would posed here. So when you think about the social values that can guide or kind of inform new developments in the city, what do you think about from a values perspective? And then how does your work in city government act to implement these values, or how do you think about kind of how these values can guide what cities are doing? So would love to hear from either one of you. I don't know who wants to start, to just give us a sense of who you are and set us up with these questions and just sort of let us know what's on your mind and what you get up to.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll start.
Okay.
So one, it's an honor to be here to represent Mayor Peduto here in Boston. Mayors often have a thing where they exhibit a lot of respect for each other's work, and Mayor Walsh and Mayor Peduto no exception in that. So I just want to give a little context to some of my work and why it matters to me, and the idea of being Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief Equity Officer, and I look at it as two sides of a brain, if you will. My Chief Equity Officer is what I look at as our aspirational reality, right? Pittsburgh, in many senses, you'll hear is known as one of the most livable cities in America, if not the most livable city in America. And modern media and the current media has done a really great job presenting that idea. It is also a recent report came out stating that it was the worst place in America for Black women. In that, even though this is hyperbole, that if you were a black person, you could go anywhere else in America and do better. Right now, I know that that's the stuff that reports are made of, right? People are supposed to say those kind of things. But what it did was underscore our challenges and underscore the fact that you could have two things happening at the same time. You could be a city that rebuilt itself from steel, that rebuilt itself from harmful economic strategies into a tech-based economy, with all these new things happening, new restaurants, people coming back into the city, stopping the quote-unquote bleeding of population for the first time in a generation. And at the same time, see most of the population loss actually be African Americans, not only to the first ring suburbs, but also actually to Sunbelt cities, right? So this is the challenge of our time. And also Pittsburgh is a city that has not traditionally had a lot of inbound immigration, that now we found ourselves with more inbound immigration than ever before. So here's the challenge of our time. And in response to the challenge of our time, previously there was a Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment, and that Pittsburgh, very much like Boston, is a city of neighborhoods with a strong identity of neighborhoods and who's who and what's what. And as you can imagine, as I'm sure is happening here, those have shifted a lot in the last 20 to 25 years. And so I always like to say, while sometimes we said we had a space problem, what we really did had a race problem. We really said we had a neighborhood problem, but we didn't have a neighborhood problem. We had a race problem that played out via neighborhoods. And so we knew that the order of the day, in order to truly make sure we are a city that can compete in the 21st century, is actually frame an office of equity. Because now we become like human-centered. We start dealing with human capital because we do relatively well in the city at dealing with housing. And that came because in the 70s, just giving you a brief context, in the 70s, the city of Pittsburgh basically said, we're not building anything else, and we'll leave it to community groups and everyone to build it, right? Which is the stuff that people love, because then community groups started to build housing, community organizers turned into community-based organizations that then turned into community development corporations. But what happened, there were clear winners and losers in that conversation. So places that had more capacity rebuilt themselves faster. Places that got more resources from the state and federal government because they were more sophisticated in how they did their work and had more access, actually rebuilt their neighborhoods faster. So what you would find is two neighborhoods separated by a street that, the income, the median home income went up $100,000 in one and $6,000 in another. And it all has to do with race. Right? So we saw these kind of things happening. So we realized that at some juncture, the CDC landscape that was creating the winners and losers, that the city had to become a bit more muscular in talking about this concept. And that's one of the things I think that our administration has been thoughtful around, and making sure, affirming that it's not for all of us, it's not for any of us. And that literally the city cannot succeed going forward. So when we really started to talk about from a real estate perspective, and I work really closely with our Urban Redevelopment Authority, which is our economic development arm. Unlike a lot of cities, ours is separate. It actually was the first economic development organization chartered in the country by then Mayor David Lawrence. So we work a lot and very closely with that organization to really think about these things. And the three things right now, I would say the social values that matter most to me are one, opportunity, because right now we just find that the opportunities are much smaller for folks in certain neighborhoods than other neighborhoods. And it actually can break down and have a quality of life difference of about 15 years between a half a mile and a mile in the city of Pittsburgh for actual life expectancy. So the opportunities itself is one of the biggest challenges that we have. Second is the actual idea of equity. And for me, kind of influence and really think about equity is the idea or the stage in a place where race is not a stand-in for quality of life. Right? So that's a really big and broad standpoint, but it really helps me do my work, because if we're not moving towards there, we're not becoming more equitable. And that doesn't mean if we don't build an affordable housing thing, or we don't give out some business loans, and people often will take that as equity, right? But if you're not moving the needle and actually looking at race or gender or orientation not being a stand-in for quality of life, then it's not really more equitable. So we kind of really raise that up and talk about that. And thirdly is fairness. And I use fairness in particular versus justice. And the reason I do that is because in Pittsburgh, we've had a really big transition of the African American community out of the city. So you have a lot of people who are now in the city of Pittsburgh and their families have left. So let's say, I often talk about the equity dividend in housing, because people will say, okay, well, why don't you give us these properties, and then we'll turn these properties over to people, and then they'll be able to build wealth. And I'll say, well, are they from Pittsburgh, right? Like, I'm not from Pittsburgh. So if you give me something because of what happened traditionally in Pittsburgh, you are conferring upon me a benefit to whom, generally speaking, all black folks in America have been given a short shift. But specifically, you're giving me the shift that someone that now lives in North Carolina really deserves. Because they're the family who literally was disenfranchised from their homes, right? And so really looking at this fairness and equity dividend, and to whom is the equity dividend paid when we're looking at public policy, is a really big and important thing for me. I think I probably went over my 3 minutes, so I'll stop there. I'll get back to the second one after.
No. Can you just say one thing,
Sure.
and we'll get to Taylor, one thing about how, so you've laid out very nicely for us how you think about the values around equity and opportunity. Can you just give us a word on how you're able to move to implementing that in your role or beyond?
I'll try to be shorter than
That's
I
great.
was on
Just
that one.
give us a tease.
So the first one is our work around P4, and that's People, Place, Planet, and Performance. And this was started as a collaboration between Mayor Peduto and the Heinz Endowments, a philanthropic organization out of Pittsburgh. And it really was acknowledging that for Pittsburgh to really be able to compete globally, that we had to focus on those 4 things. But we also always wanted to make sure that people was first, right? So we didn't want to deal with planet first or performance first, because what you lead with is what you get, right? So we underwent this process of really making and shaping all of our work under these 4 Ps and making sure that we're seeing the world through that lens. And in our economic development strategies, it actually serves as an underwriting of sorts. So when projects now come to our Urban Redevelopment Authority, they are judged based on these principles and actually receive subsidy or support based upon how well they're serving all 4 of those things in a metric that the organization has. So that's one very clear way, and we're looking from a real estate perspective. We're really looking to make sure how beneficial are these things being to communities, first and foremost, when we're looking to subsidize it or looking to go to the state and federal authorities for more resources.
Great. No, thank you so much. So Taylor, give us a sense of kind of paint a picture for us a little bit in terms of, again, the values for you that you feel like are guiding new developments in the city, and how you think about kind of implementing and activating that work. And just love to hear just a sense of what you're looking at, and give us an overview there. It would be great.
Yeah, so excited to be here and to be part of this panel. Was not terribly familiar with Pittsburgh before, but hearing you talk about the city makes me think of there's so many connections between Boston and Pittsburgh. So really excited to be able to have that conversation, and then so excited to be on a panel with Karilyn. I am relatively new to the city, have been in this role for about 3.5 months, and came to City Hall by way of academia, which is not a typical progression, but actually about 3 years ago, I did a summer fellowship at the city, and one of the folks that I got to sit down with was actually Karilyn, and just gave me this image of what someone with a social science PhD background could do. So really kind of helped set me on this trajectory to where I am now. So great to be in this space now. So I am the director of the Mayor's Housing Innovation Lab, and have a quote on the board. And so I like to start by saying that, like any good urbanist, or like most good urbanists, I have a huge fandom for Jane Jacobs, or JJ, as I call her. She is someone that I have read and absorbed, and so her frameworks about the eyes on the street, the sidewalk ballet, the organized complexity of urban life are things that I've very much adopted over the course of my time in graduate school, and are now things that I think about on a daily basis in this new role. And so one of the many things that I really appreciate about Jane Jacobs is that she really offers this framework for how we look at space, and how we make sense of how a space is created, and how space is actually made into place. And for Jane Jacobs, the answer of how a space becomes a place that has meaning, the answer is always people. It's the people that can turn a street into a playground. It's people that can turn a building into a home. And so one of the things that I try to really bring to this work in the city is really how do we prioritize people in all of the decisions that we're making. So this quotation that's behind us on the board and the accompanying sentiment behind it is, on the one hand, something that's really, really important to hold on to. This prioritization of a city is only best when it is something that is planned and designed by everyone, but it's also an incredibly challenging sentiment to hold on to as someone who's now in local government, because that's not often or historically the role that we have played in cities, is looking to people as co-creators of how cities are planned. So I like to keep this as a reminder as I kind of venture into this new space and have conversations with folks in the building as we're thinking about what's the role, or how are we working with people to really grow Boston as a city. So one of the things that can often happen when we're having conversations about housing and development is that we get caught up in this idea of designing a dream city as opposed to rebuilding a living city. And that kind of framework is also from Jane Jacobs. She'll pop up a lot in how I talk. But I think that it's really important to think about how we aren't creating lots of new things. We have to be mindful of the fact that in all of our cities, people already live there and will continue to live there. So how do we create change that is really, that people feel a part of that change as opposed to change happening to them? So in a lot of ways over the past few years, the city has made some pretty significant strides in changing how it interacts with residents and how it has conversations about development, about housing, and brings up all of these really challenging questions around who is Boston for, who owns the city, and how do we change together? And those are the types of questions that do not have easy answers at all. If someone has an easy answer to those types of questions, then please come and talk to me afterwards, because I would love to hear them. But I think how we are starting to try to answer those questions is changing how we collaborate with residents and how we offer frameworks for how residents can think about using the existing space that they have. So one of the projects that we've worked on at the lab over the past few years is working with residents to build out new units in their home, so additional dwelling units. So that's an instance of us working in really close partnership with folks in the city to create new opportunity in buildings that they have control over. We're also exploring different housing typologies in the city. So we've been doing a lot of work around artist live work guidelines and what does it mean to have a city that has a vibrant and creative arts economy. And we're also doing a lot of work to identify what are the barriers to folks having a sense of residential stability. And there can be a lot of factors that play a role in folks' ability to really see a future for themselves in place. So one project where kind of all of this comes together, where we're thinking about how we interact with residents, where we think about how we are ensuring that the future of Boston is one that is diverse, that is inclusive, is some work that we're doing around how do we develop city-owned parcels and buildings. So think of things like libraries and fire stations and community centers, even municipal parking lots. So these spaces that are often anchor institutions, they're places where folks are spending a lot of time in or coming to. How can we actually look to the potential rehab, redevelopment of those spaces and enhance their value by adding housing on top, so that a library continues to serve as both this gathering place for community, but also offers an opportunity for folks to live above it and to go to the library when they're home on the weekend, or to go to the library after school and then go up to their apartment. So that is one project that I really think captures these values that we're trying to grapple with right now as a city, is how can we work with residents to imagine new spaces-ish, but existing spaces in ways that meet our needs moving forward in the future.
No, it's great. It's great. And then I think for me, if I could add to kind of my assessment of the Boston landscape when I was there, in the role that I had, I feel like, although I wasn't on the housing side of things, thinking about economic development in the Boston landscape was very interesting and challenging, because I think particularly in the last number of years and even now, Boston as a city and greater Boston is in an incredible moment of economic growth. Historically, people are saying that this is quite possibly the largest moment of expansion in the city's history in terms of real estate growth, of numbers of square footage, the scale of square footage that's being added to the city. There's a report that's come out, I think I had made a note to myself, a developer's report that was saying that Boston right now, if you were to look at the cranes in the sky, and so there's an anecdote that looking at numbers of cranes in the sky can give you a sense of, like, obviously the commercial activity in the city. And right now Boston has the 9th most cranes in the sky in the country. And so it's giving us an indication of the scale of growth and change that's happening here. I think number one is Seattle, and then there's LA and Denver, so there's a lot happening to the west. But on the East Coast, Boston is this kind of in this moment of tremendous expansion. The challenge is, although that there are some really optimum sort of economic conditions overall, that there are pockets of the city and demographics where that benefit and that growth is not being experienced. And so already, I think from Majestic and Taylor, we're hearing this critique of kind of how do we think about economic indicators in the context of equity. And so if we're thinking about equity as a particular type of value, that's often offering a corrective. And so it's saying there's something that's not happening in the market. The market's growth or the benefits are not being extended to certain parts of the city's population, whether that has a racial overlay, a geographic overlay. And the question becomes, how do you take this moment of growth and opportunity and extend it to these populations that are not feeling the benefit? And so as a framing, equity kind of gives us a way to think about how we might do that. For me, when I was in my role in the city, these are things that I was constantly thinking about. The fact that the city of Boston also is experiencing historic low unemployment rate. I think now we're hovering around 3% or so. So incredible growth in terms of jobs, incredible growth in terms of just pure, raw growth in industry. The city now has about 800,000 jobs that are right now in play for a city population that's about 700,000 people. So then if you have that kind of setup, it seems like you don't have an employment issue, right? You have everyone having a job, but when you add to that the fact that I think the stat is about 62% of the people who are working in the city live outside of the city. So right now, I've just told you that about 500,000 or so of these jobs are being held by people who don't live in the city. So if you're someone who's in city government, these kinds of disparities, these kind of mismatches are the things that are really guiding how you're thinking about policy, how you're thinking about partnerships, how you're thinking about what are you trying to make possible and what are the actual economic indicators that are going to tell you whether or not your work is successful. For me, in my role in the city, I thought quite a lot about small businesses and the fact that the city of Boston has the distinction of having this enormous small business ecosystem, about 40,000 small businesses across the city. And what's interesting is the fact that those cities are so important for job creation. And I constantly looked at the ways that jobs were actually stabilizing not only the city's growth, but the benefit for residents in these neighborhoods. And so these 40,000 businesses were creating about 170,000 jobs for Boston residents. And again, I say for Boston residents. And so trying to think about how our strategies and how our policies in terms of how we're supporting small businesses could be providing an equity-focused agenda, could be providing a corrective. And to me, I guess to answer my own question about the values, there's a real value and a need for us to take an intersectional approach to how we think about public policy. And so it's very difficult to separate out race, gender, sexuality, geography, citizenship status, national origin. how can you have a policy that honestly takes an intersectional approach at thinking about the impacts of all of these things together? That's hard work, but important work. A way that I think Taylor may agree with in terms of how social science can help us think about policy setting that really can meet equity-based challenges in a robust way. And so I think that that's kind of part of what we want to add to this discussion, which is how can we think through what are the policies and who are the partners, who are the investors, who are the other even non-government actors that can help us move these kind of agendas that are really targeting populations and communities that are not experiencing economic growth and opportunity, even in a market like Boston that is literally on fire, again, in terms of all of these traditional economic indicators. And so I would then pivot back to the panel a little bit in terms of asking the question that for me is really around, I wonder what is a policy maybe that you all are working on or thinking about where private investors and maybe other real estate actors can have a role in what you're doing? Is there something that you're working on where you're seeing real promise and opportunity in terms of equity and these kinds of partners, or is there something you're imagining as a next step or a next kind of way to move the portfolio, items in your portfolio that are really nagging you? Just wondering kind of if there's an example that you can offer and if there's any kind of promise or a pitfall baked in there.
So I'll kind of look at that from two angles. The first angle, and I guess we talk about policy, and I'll speak for, I don't know how Massachusetts is, but Pennsylvania, we are precluded from doing a as a city, we're precluded by doing almost everything by state law. Okay. So, Pennsylvania state law is really strong on ownership. Pennsylvania state law is really, and the government has been constructed to preempt cities from doing a lot of tinkering, if you will, right? So we spend a lot of time in court, frankly, around different policies that cities now across the country are adopting. And to make it worse, we are what they call second-class city. So in Pennsylvania, it's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Well, Philadelphia is the first-class city, which is a whole host of things that they can do. They can tax themselves. We cannot tax ourselves. Okay. You have to equalize the taxes out by state law. So we find ourselves with not a lot of actual policy tools, frankly, that allow us to do things I do see happen in Boston and do happen in DC and do happen in San Francisco. You really find it like we don't have a lot of those levers. A lot of the levers that we actually have what I would call the pulpit of advancing these concepts. So, for example, we recently have passed an inclusionary model. It is relatively, by American city standards right now, relatively lame. 10% at 50.
Room for growth.
The fight we've had over this one, you would say, we've had it from the developers and advocates, right? Okay. The developers are fighting us tooth and nail, saying that this market doesn't work if we don't have 10-year abatements at full abatement going on. Okay. Right? Advocates are saying, I'm seeing stuff all across the city, houses are $400,000. Everyone's getting rich. What do you do, right? So to me, if one group of people is happy with public policy, you probably didn't do enough, because there's just different factors that are pulling to really advance concepts. So we came up with 10% at 50. We have Pittsburgh has. We don't just have like a tale of two cities. We really have about 7 different economic conditions. Right? So we're not like one of those cities where either everything's good or everything's bad. We have some solidly middle-class neighborhoods that are not changing. We have some lower-class neighborhoods that are not changing. We have some neighborhoods that are undergoing rapid change, right? So we looked at, okay, for neighborhoods that already have affordable housing, if you will, right? What can you do to incentivize developers to create things that are relevant to those places? So we looked at 60% at 80% AMI. So we just said 10% at 50 because we acknowledge that 50 and lower is our deepest area of need. And then we had the 60 at 80 because we also want to create a level of capacity where people can move around the city. In our city, we're actually at equilibrium 80 AMI. but obviously lower is where we find our biggest challenges, right? So we really went and moved on this. But interestingly, what we're seeing now is there are developers coming into the city who have been used to working in other cities, who don't even want the abatement, who will do 10% at 50 AMI just because they know it's good business.
Okay.
Right? They know it's good business to do it. They're not asking for it. They work the pro forma out. They know how to make it work, right? Our developers, and anyone that's a developer in Pittsburgh, I'm telling the truth. Our developers have been subsidized for so long because of the economic conditions of the city that's how the development works, right? I mean, the developments only work if you get LIHTCs or now the deep abatements, right? So we have now folks coming in and saying, yeah, we're going to do affordable housing in neighborhoods of opportunity because we just know it's good business, and we actually want to be held up as examples by the mayor of people who are trying to create this Pittsburgh that works for everybody, right? So while the policy lever is one lever, actually the larger conversation about it, we're finding that more people are actually engaging with us to do that kind of work. So that's something that we're feeling good about. On another level, the ADU policy is really just, we're beginning to do it in particular neighborhood as a pilot to really be able to see, okay, how many units does it create? What kind of context does it create in the neighborhood, right? Because this particular neighborhood is structured. We don't have a lot of dense neighborhoods. Most of our neighborhoods are relatively spread out. So this particular neighborhood, as it rebuilt itself, did it with kind of ranch-style houses, square block ranch-style houses. So they have space in the back to do ADUs.
Low density.
Yeah, low density, so they can add density via the ADU. So we're looking to see, kind of the possibilities for what that can really look like in the city. So we have the invisible lever, if you will, and then we actually have the lever of looking at ADUs and seeing if it can work as a pilot, and then make it broadly work in the city.
Great, thanks. Taylor, give us a policy example or something
Yeah.
you're working on or wishing for.
Yeah, so I can talk about something that the lab has done, and then can talk about one of the things that we're currently kind of cooking up and thinking about. And I was going to talk about compact living, but maybe I talk about our exploration into additional dwelling units. This is something, that you're currently in the pilot stage for. So similarly, in Boston, we started with a pilot for additional dwelling units, which we define as units that are within the existing envelope of a building. So think about a basement conversion, an attic conversion, or carving out like a first or second floor and turning that into a rental unit. So that's something we started as a pilot in 3 neighborhoods in Boston. So we looked at East Boston, we looked at Mattapan, and then we looked at Jamaica Plain. And we really wanted to cover a number of different parts of the city that were experiencing different types of challenges. So in East Boston, we know we have a number of 3 families there. We knew we had folks there who had already kind of converted their triple deckers into what would now be considered additional dwelling units. So we wanted to help folks kind of bring those online in a more formal capacity, and saw an opportunity to help existing homeowners in East Boston really bring in some additional income to potentially help them stay in place. With Mattapan, it's a neighborhood where there are a large number of single-family homes, so it provided this opportunity to add kind of gentle density or a little bit of density to that particular neighborhood. And then in Jamaica Plain, that's the neighborhood that I live in. It's a neighborhood where folks like to say like things will fly in Jamaica Plain, like folks will test stuff out or like humor you. So that was part of the thinking of looking at Jamaica Plain, but it's also a neighborhood that has a mix of housing types. So Jamaica Plain has 3 triple deckers, 3 families, some 2 families, and then a few single family homes. So presented a nice kind of range of typologies. So over the course of that 18-month pilot period, what we did was work really closely with residents, because some of the biggest challenges that we heard was that folks didn't know how to move through the permitting process, because it can be incredibly confusing. So we created these design workshops where folks could come in and meet with city staff to get feedback on this plan that they had, to ask some questions. And so it was a really close collaboration between the Department of Neighborhood Development, which is where the Housing Innovation Lab sits, the Inspectional Services Department, which kind of signs off on building permits, and then also the Boston Planning and Development Agency and the Fire Department, who were other agencies that were very deeply involved in this pilot process. So over the course of that period, we had over 70 folks from each of those 3 neighborhoods, or total from the 3 neighborhoods, apply to turn some space in their building into additional dwelling units. From that 70, about 12 actually move forward with doing construction permits, because one of the things that we discovered is that turning or creating a new unit in your building can be pretty expensive, depending on the type of building you have. So for 3 families, we saw very few of those, because if you have a 3-family and you add a unit, you actually have to sprinkler that entire building, and that cost is around like $50,000 just for sprinkling. So that makes it really challenging for folks to kind of to move forward with that type of project. But we actually saw a lot of folks in single families and 2 families kind of be able to figure out the financing to make that work. And as a city, we offered loans to folks who were interested in kind of testing out this model based on specific income criteria. You could qualify for a loan to help kind of subset the construction price for this additional dwelling unit. So after that 18-month period, we reflected on what we kind of heard from folks, heard a lot of enthusiasm about the fact that folks were able to either bring in additional rental income, or in a lot of cases, provide housing for their older adult children who are coming home, or thinking about downsizing themselves and then renting out their larger apartment. So really helped meet a lot of different needs for folks in those 3 neighborhoods, which helped us make the case for, well, we should think about doing this citywide. Can we open up the opportunity? So over the summer of this year, actually, we did a round of community meetings in a number of different neighborhoods, and actually passed a zoning amendment to allow additional dwelling units across the city, which then helped us make the case to increase this loan program to really be able to offer some assistance to folks who were invested in exploring creating new units, and then also help set the stage for what will be our next exploration outside the envelope, getting a little wild over here, and looking at whether it's backyard units, or what we're actually thinking about is carriage houses in Boston. So these are existing structures. There are many instances of carriage houses being demolished because folks can't really do anything with them at the moment. So if we can provide a pathway for folks to be able to turn their carriage houses into rental spaces, provides yet another kind of step towards more housing opportunity in the city. So we're really excited about that beginning exploration.
Great.
One of the things I just wanted to mention really fast, because we talked about it, was for us also modular.
Yeah.
It costs to build a unit in the city of Pittsburgh, if you take a lot of state, federal, and city money, around $400,000 a unit. And that's just vestiges of a lot of different stuff, whether it's, labor costs, whether it's, in Pittsburgh, when things were demolished up until about 1990 something, everything went in the ground. So when something was just packed in. So now when we're going back and we're getting parcels to developers and parcels to community development corporations, people are going in and they're saying, this is another $70,000 a unit to be able to get everything out of the ground, right? And so, again, just trying to use the levers, we're looking at module and partnering with a module developer to really see, can they bring the cost down, and then with a soft second mortgage really get the number to where, around that like 150, 160 area, and how can we provide some subsidy to get it there so they can get these on the market faster, because the turnaround time is faster, especially if the parcel is clean. So we work on brownfield development, we'll get brownfield grants, work on the site, and then do the modular to be able to speed up the process.
Great, so innovative too. So the floor is open. So you've heard from Taylor and Majestic what they're doing in Boston. and Pittsburgh and what's on the table. And I'd love to hear from you. Questions, comments? Open.
Hi there.
Hi.
Annie Thompson, know a lot of people here. I have a question for you. I don't think it's really addressed to Boston. I mean, Boston's a city where there's a differential tax rate. Did go down, but it has a lot of commercial development already. I think I have a question both as a housing person and also as a person who grew up in Hartford, Connecticut and has been back there very recently. How do you get to the point where you can actually draw people in? And kind of on a second point, without a differential tax base, trying to get commercial development in, how do you build additional housing, which largely will draw in families because that's what you're based on, which increases cost because education is the primary cost for a municipality. How do you reach that balance? I look at Hartford, as I said, I grew up there, and the city has gone to crap, literally, and it's bankrupt, and they're trying in every way they can to fix it and bring something in there and regenerate it. So in any case, that's kind of what I'm looking at. How do you get to the point where, one, businesses will move there so you can improve the city because you have the resources to do so, and consequently improve the livelihoods of the people that are there because you're going to improve the education and the whole kind of.
So I'll say for us, our cycle has been, one, most of the new we call it multi-family developments, they're not family developments. They're 1 and 2 bedrooms, right? And what we find is they're high income and expensive for Pittsburgh. For most of you would come and love to live in probably marble studded stuff in Pittsburgh for $1,500 to $2,000, but in our city, that's really expensive. The median income for African Americans is $21,000. So you put that in context. So we're finding that that's being taken in, frankly, by some folks who are living closer to work at Google, living closer to work at Uber, living closer to work at a lot of the tech places. The other thing is being taken in by college students, right? So but for us, frankly, it was a release from the pressures that some of the colleges were putting on our neighborhoods. Because it's easy for somebody to come in and buy a house for $200,000 and their child's going to live there for the next 4 years. They split the house up 4 different ways, big apart. Everyone gets a big room, a kitchen downstairs, and the rent is $1,200-$1,300. The mortgage is $1,300 a month, and then the young people split that and some. So actually, a lot of our multifamily stuff is going to release the valve on our neighborhoods, which actually for us is good. To answer the second question, I think what often happens is when CDCs do work, or when thoughtful developers come in and engage in neighborhoods, when things start to change, you also see, and we as our Urban Redevelopment Authority, we often cross-subsidize commercial space anyway, right? The mayor will say, or we'll say, the community will say, we want commercial space, so we'll condo it out, right? We'll white box it and say, okay, we'll do some basic fit outs, but you can come in and do the rest of it. And frankly, that gives them the ability to come in and do that. Where we're getting the challenge now is making sure that community-oriented businesses get a chance to come into those condo white boxes and then create opportunities for work in the neighborhoods. Because what has happened is, of course, Warby Parker is going to come in. Of course, Honey Grove's going to come in. Of course, we got one called Something Factory, Milkshake Factory, Blank Factory.
Okay.
So that's going to happen, but what actually our administration did was create a pilot program for African American female entrepreneurs that can serve as a passageway for when we do developments. We have a choice neighborhood development that is coming to pass, that actually those business owners can go into those condo commercial spaces that we've created, that we've cross-subsidized and collateralized and created. So we're trying to really figure out that mix of the business flow and the commercial concept, but it all really starts because whether the city does it or whether a developer does it, it really creates a context where people see bodies, they see people walking, and they want to be there.
Next question in the back. Yeah, right there.
And for the sake of time, we're going to have 2 audience members say their questions, and you guys can just take both of them on.
Sure. So it seems like the cost problem in Boston, just the cost of housing, is a supply problem. And while ADUs kind of are trying to impact that, it doesn't seem like that's a very scalable option. So what specific policy recommendations do you have for the city to increase supply at scale and lower the cost of housing across the board? I mean, to me, like more density comes to mind, so increasing height restrictions and other options.
And our second question.
Hi. Similar question, which is that it seems like a lot of the policies are looking at aspirational, what can we do, what can we change, and what's new. And I guess the question comes, what can be done on some of the structural issues built around costs and zoning and just things about like, do we need so much parking? Do we need some of those issues? And some of the things you're fighting, for instance, the fire department pretty much putting $15,000 on every single unit in buildings. Is that really a necessary life safety issue? And so I guess some of the questions are, what are the structural things that can be really transformative if we just fight them or say, hey, do we really need this?
Yeah. So I will kind of bring, those questions are already very much connected, so I'll answer them together. And I would actually start by saying I think it's both thinking about how we use our existing housing stock, but also thinking about how we create opportunities for new construction. So one of the programs that the Housing iLab works on is intergenerational home share. So how we connect older adults who have spare rooms to folks who are looking for rental opportunities. And so kind of on its face, that might not sound like a program that's gonna suddenly bring lots of new housing opportunities online. But in 2017, there was a study that showed that in the homes of baby boomers in Boston, there are 34,000 spare rooms every night. That is a huge number of rooms sitting empty in the city of Boston that we could potentially create, that could become homes or become rental opportunities for folks. So that's one way we're kind of thinking about our existing housing stock and how we do or use those spaces differently. So ADUs, intergenerational home share, those types of programs kind of fit in that camp. And then when we're thinking about new construction and how we encourage additional density, encourage projects that are transit oriented, so transit being both the T, but also thinking about some of our bus lines. One of the projects that we've moved forward is around compact living. So how we can thoughtfully design smaller spaces for residents to live in that incorporate shared amenities, but are also close to different types of public transportation options. And those guidelines really get at this point around how much parking we're creating in different residential buildings and really trying to incentivize developers who are doing compact projects to think about offering bicycle parking or, instead of offering parking just for cars, doing bicycle parking instead, subsidizing the T-passes for residents of that building and really prioritizing different modes of transportation other than cars. So that's an instance where we've really kind of started to think differently about what we're asking developers to do when it comes to building new construction and creating a framework for how they can build different types of projects that potentially increase the supply of housing in the city. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One thing really quickly we try to do is think about having an ombudsman of sorts. We know in a lot of our pro formas in the city, the time it takes to get the deal done is written into the pro forma. And so we know that if something is really meeting this people, place, planning, and performance level, that we actually want to speed your process up to get done faster through our system. And if it gets done faster through the system, then it costs everyone less money. Because we know that the holding costs are a huge cost of the new construction element. Another thing we've done is that we've done a riverfront zoning module for everything that's on our rivers. And we said, okay, if you do things like sustainability things, you minimize parking, we'll allow you height elevations, right? We'll reduce the height restrictions because we acknowledge if you're getting to the crux of the core of what we find important for values, if you want to raise if you want to build more housing, that's fine. So we really are trying to play with those levers in those areas that folks don't have a challenge with it going vertical. In a lot of our neighborhoods, stuff going high is not going to happen, right? But we know in the riverfronts and in certain places where that is not as much of a challenge, that we want to reduce those. And the parking minimums are a huge fight in our city right now because our Department of Mobility and Infrastructure is fighting for reducing the minimums and doing away with a lot of it. But different community groups and neighborhood groups are fighting that because they're saying if you get rid of them, they're still going to have a car and they're going to park in the neighborhood. So.
I also appreciate the question on the density piece. In the city of Boston, there's definitely a lot of resistance on the local level in terms of what density means for residents because the city has this sort of architectural tradition of triple deckers or kind of really low density. And so asking that kind of a question becomes culturally significant, but also from a policy perspective, very tricky. The supply question is definitely on the table. Sort of this idea that what we need to do is build more houses, more and more. This is a real thing. This is something that the mayor has prioritized, but also the question of cost that you bring up is significant because of the cost of labor in this town. On top of the cost of land, which we know is high, the cost of actually getting people to work on these sites is pricey. And that is, in terms of a jobs policy, that was something that was a priority in my own portfolio to think about the Boston resident jobs policy as a national premier policy in the 80s when it was created to make sure that people in the city locally could take advantage of these as construction booms. And so for me, there was real leadership at times among developers who were really willing to be at the table to understand that the price of doing business in Boston could be high because baked into that formula was a way to make sure that residents, people of color and women were being able to take advantage of this kind of economic activity. And we saw that as an important investment as well as the investment in contributing to the housing supply overall.
Great. We have time for one more question. Dennis, do you want?
I'm just, we only briefly, Majestic, I think you mentioned it, talked about inclusionary policies. With all respect to Boston, we're sitting here in Cambridge, which has one of the most successful programs in the country, where the requirement for affordable housing in all residential development is now 20%.
Amazing.
And the city is considering an overlay zone across the entire city where you would not require a zoning variance to build housing anywhere.
Which is amazing.
Pardon?
Which is amazing.
Well, we'll see if it goes through. My wife's in charge of this program, which is why I'm on a soapbox.
Fair enough.
And it seems to me that particularly, of course, this works in cities which are economically booming.
Yeah.
Okay, but particularly in those times, we need policies that extract
Exactly.
from the private sector. And it didn't take much to extract it. There was not a lot of opposition from the development community in Cambridge for these changes because it increases the value of the neighborhoods, and that context increases the value of the properties that are not affordable.
Okay.
So I just think we need policies that can move from those who are making a lot of money through real estate to those who need to be able to get into the market, and there are some really good examples out there.
So I'm really going to probably go past one of the taboos of talking about inclusionary as a person that cares about equity.
Yeah.
I don't always think inclusionary works, and this is the reason. All the places that are doing really well are not neighborhoods of opportunity. We've seen situations people are moving from neighborhoods where they had social networks, they had social capital, their children went to school, and they're moving to neighborhoods 2 buses away to live in a place, and they're extremely isolated, right? We're doing the right thing from a moral perspective. We're doing the right thing we are subsidizing the wealth generation of others, but I sometimes question, are we thinking about the individuals whose lives we are impacting? And then what kind of work is being done from a civic association level to make sure when people are moving into neighborhoods that they are connecting to the social fabric of that place versus just living in isolation, right? Because for us, some neighborhoods that have changed rapidly, the schools aren't good. And frankly, the folks in the neighborhood don't send their children to the schools. Yeah. So the schools are still challenged, but the houses are $400,000. There's no supermarket because everyone drives to go to another neighborhood, right? So inclusionary itself obviously is a good moral and economic thing. I think you have a level of density and a level of kind of in services, and you're not subsidizing everything. We're subsidizing everything, right? Sometimes we don't really have a market, because if you didn't have this abatement, you couldn't do the deal, right? So I think in different places, inclusionary represents different things, right?
Yeah.
And
You have to be able to afford it.
you have to be able to afford it and really be able to create those levels of those units, but then also create those levels of community that people deserve.
It is true, people are moving from their neighborhoods into a new apartment building or something.
Right.
There are positives and negatives. One, people have mixed income housing. But it is true that you have to move out of the neighborhood that you were in, of course.
Right.
Yes, which could be liable.
And this question about the density of services, but also the social networks that are disrupted and in need of repair once people make this movement is a very compelling argument as well.